Hello, good morning, and welcome to this final session of Beyond Boundaries, the virtual conference. And today we're going to be discussing some of the economic, political, ecological, and institutional challenges to enable us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've called this session Achieving Inclusive Wealth. And we've got a fantastic panel. So I hope it's going to be lively and interesting and valuable to all of you. We're so pleased to have Professor Siddhartha Dasgupta, who's the Frank Ramsey Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge. He's arguably the most distinguished sustainability economist in the world. He's advised the UN. He's currently advising the UK government with his wonderful report that you can download, The Economics of Biodiversity. And he's a fellow at the British Academy, the Royal Society, and the US National Academy of Sciences. We've got Professor Wendy Carlin, who is an internationally known professor of economics at UCL. She's a macroeconomist. She advises the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility. But in the last several years, she's been thinking a lot about how you teach economics. And has brought about a substantial change in the way that's done in universities across the UK. We've got Kate Jones, who's a British biodiversity scientist with a special interest in bats. She's a professor of ecology and biodiversity, director of the Biodiversity Modelling Research Group at UCL. And allegedly, Charles Darwin is her 8th cousin, 6 times removed, which sounds a little bit like homeopathic dilution of her genes, but never mind. We've got Carol Cadwallader, who is an internationally known investigative journalist who put out one of the best TED Talks ever heard. She works for The Guardian and Observer and has campaigned really against the manipulation of democracy by social media companies, by Cambridge Analytica, by Facebook. And she's uncovered multiple crimes committed during the Euro referendum and Russian interference in Brexit. And finally, we have Professor Ibrahim Abubakar, who is the director of the Institute for Global Health. He's an infectious disease epidemiologist. He's an expert on tuberculosis and advises WHO on that, but he's also chair of the Lancet Commission on Migration, which has been a global collaboration to advance migration health. And he also has strong views on the decolonialization of global health generally. So it's a fantastic panel. And I'm going to kick off by welcoming Siddhartha and asking a very simple question. What do we mean by inclusive wealth?
Well, thank you very much. The idea of inclusive wealth is to get an index of the assets an economy has at its disposal. Maybe it owns it or has access to it. That's the reason behind it, is to find a way to determine whether what we have inherited from the past is what we are, at least that much is being transmitted to the next generation. It's something that we're concerned with when we ask ourselves what sustainable development means. My own interest in developing the notion began when I read the Brundtland Commission report of 1987, which defined development that meets the needs, defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we're looking at what we might call the means towards human flourishing. At the end of the day, we are interested in human flourishing, some notion of, let us say, the common good across the generations. And we want to ask whether, as we move through time, things are improving in terms of, measured in terms of flourishing lives. So we want something like a mapping from means to ends, whereas the ends are the ultimate goal. And we want to find way to ensure that measuring the means enables us to measure the goals, that the two move in the same way. They're not the same object, but it can be that if you measure the means well enough, clearly enough, it will correspond to the goal, to the aims, to the ends. Now, what do you include in your assets? Asset is a durable object, and they can be very abstract. Culture is an asset. Institutions are asset, and yet it would be foolhardy to try and measure it. Try and measure good governance, and you'll throw up your hands. On the other hand, we do know that good governance is valuable because it enables things to happen. It enables assets to flow better, make use of the assets in a better way. So measurability is something which disciplines the need for measuring objects, disciplines our quest for trying to identify what we should call productive base, in line with the Brundtland Commission report. So the classification that is proved to be useful in practical work, there's no unique way of doing this, but the one we have works as well as any, is to think of three broad categories of capital goods. We'll call them capital goods: produced capital, roads, buildings, machines, ports; human capital, education, health, aptitude, aspirations; and natural capital, the biosphere's goods and services. Increasingly, we've been able to measure, of course, albeit incompletely, imperfectly, but the improvements are taking place in measuring the value of these assets. Now, when I say the value, I mean their contributions to the common good. I don't mean market prices. Market prices may be good approximations in some cases in produced capital, but they're woefully inadequate for natural capital, nature's capital, largely because much of the biosphere's goods and services come free. Worse, they have come with negative prices because governments subsidize the exploitation of natural capital. So you have these three categories of capital goods, the value of which, measured in terms of what I'll call accounting prices, because they reflect the contributions of these capital goods to the common good, that's what I'll call inclusive wealth. So inclusive wealth measures the social worth of these capital goods. So where does all these institutional matter appear? Like social capital. We sometimes even talk about religious capital. I have no idea how influential we economists have become. Everything has to be called a capital in order to make it respectable, so to speak. Cultural capital, religious capital, institutional capital, social capital, and so forth. They are there, embedded in the notion of inclusive wealth, and are reflected in the accounting prices. So if you think of two societies which have the same structure of capital goods of the kind that I mentioned, but one is at peace and the other is at war, the one at peace will be, other things equal, be wealthier, because their capital goods will be worth more. Think of a desk where you're sitting now. Its worth to you is different from what it would have been if the country had been at war. So those institutions I call them enabling assets. They're not capital goods, but they enable us to have flourishing lives if they function well.
Partha, could I just interrupt?
Yeah.
I mean, you may be going on
please.
this, but you've written a lot about the importance of trust and cooperation. And as indeed did Adam Smith in the theory of moral sentiments. And he talked about mutual sympathy as the basis of moral sentiments. But you see it not just as a nice add-on to the fundamentals of competition in an economy, but actually a fundamental feature of an economically successful economy and a sustainable one. Why has the economic mainstream ignored this about trust and cooperation being better for economic development?
There's a charitable answer and there's an uncharitable answer. The charitable answer would be it's tougher. We didn't probably have the tools to think, to conceptualize it in a concrete way. I think the uncharitable answer is the one which you would use for against any discipline. You work on the basis of the last paper you read, and you work on, you chip away. That's how scientists work, and it's a perfectly respectable way of doing things. The only problem with that is that it's very historically dependent. It's path dependent. What happens today depends on what happened yesterday. In other words, the paper you read, which was written yesterday, is the stepping stone for your work. So you could veer off in a direction, exciting problems, where you made assumptions to avoid some deep problems, and that persists. So occasionally somebody comes along and finds it interesting to tackle these. But I should say that when I ended my discourse on inclusive wealth, the trick was, the reason it's of use is that one can prove, it's a theorem, it's not an empirical observation, that inclusive wealth and the common good move in the same way. So if you measure and track inclusive wealth, other things equal, you'll be tracking the common good. It's the common good we are interested in.
So you're saying that social well-being,
yes,
goes in track with inclusive wealth.
That's exactly right.
You're not exactly saying that they go together.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so you look at, if you like, the means to the ends, and the means move in the same way. And the connection between the means and the ends are the accounting prices. So it's not as though values are missing human values are missing in inclusive wealth. They're very much embedded in the notion of inclusive wealth.
So you're from India originally, way back. Do you think India has more social capital than modern UK, US, or less?
Wow, that's a really hard question. I wouldn't know how to begin answering it, because in some directions, I would say social capital, if you look at the quality of institutions, they're pretty good in this part of the world. And that's why it's a functioning democracy. With all its weaknesses and so forth, yes, but we are now looking in broad brush terms, and we are comparing it to countries where perhaps are dysfunctional. India is not dysfunctional, goes without saying. It's a terrific place. But in some directions, of course, there is greater social capital. In villages, communities are very, very prominent. In an apartment complex here, there's hardly any social capital. You may know your next door neighbor, if that, but not many others. So it depends on the dimensions of life you consider. I don't think it's possible today to be able to rank countries in terms of social capital. It would be a misconceived research project to do that.
I'm going to park it just there for the moment. We will come back to all these issues and the questions. I'm going to move on to Wendy. And I want to ask you, in relation to some of those issues, about a narrow and a wider definition of economics. Can economics and economics teaching be part of the solution to the challenges of sustainability? And how do you think that teaching has to change?
Great question. And I think the place to start is with the students themselves. So something that we've done or encouraged to be done in universities around the world over the last several years is to pose the question, what's the most pressing problem that economists today should be addressing? So just try and kind of keep that idea in your head and imagine what you would answer, or you think that beginning students of economics would answer. And I'll just share the screen and show you what the responses have been. Okay, so I don't know what you had in your minds, but this is the results for this year, for 2019-20. We've got about 3,600 students from 17 universities, all the way from Peru to Presidency University in Kolkata, Wellington to Kansas City, universities in the UK as well. And what we find when we ask this question, which we've done since 2015, is that inequality almost always, wherever you ask the question, comes out as the most pressing problem that economists should be addressing. If you take a look here as well, you can see that climate change, sustainability, sustainable development are also very prevalent. In last year's word cloud, that was almost equal with inequality. But this year you can see that the pandemic is also on the minds of students. So let me stop the screen share. If I can do that. Yeah. Okay. So, you know, this is what students have on their minds. And then the question obviously comes to us whether we've got the goods as economists and as teachers in the classroom. And what Sapatha has already introduced is the crucial question of measurement and the great progress that's been made in allowing us to make measurements that are very relevant to the questions that students want answered. I think we can also draw a kind of broader canvas and say, do we have a kind of new economic paradigm that will allow us to address these questions? And we could think of that as having 4 levels. So where we think first of the normative foundations that would underlie such a paradigm, such a way of understanding how the world works and how it could work better. An economic model, policies that bring together the model to address the questions. And then we also need a way of talking about it, a kind of vernacular that allows us to engage, bring our lives into that broader picture of how the world works. So just let's try and see what we've got to contribute to that. So if we think of the kind of normative level, then we're thinking of values like sustainability, fairness, community, the things that have just been raised. The model, I think I would take a more optimistic stand than perhaps Sapatha did, and say that over the last 30 to 40 years, economics has really constructed the basis for a new way of thinking about the economy. And it's based on what's often called the information economics revolution, the behavioral economics revolution. So we've moved away from this world in which economics is just Homo economicus interacting with his kind, just with purely self-interested preferences. And we've moved away from that world where interactions are really in markets with complete contracts. Just to give you an example of what I mean is now we think of, say, the labor market, and we don't think of a market like this, right? This is what you get if you ask people to say what economics is about. They say it's this or this. So about clearing markets. We now always think about labor markets as markets in which there's always involuntary unemployment, so the market doesn't clear. So we have got a lot of the goods. We have a much richer conception of human behavior. We have a model in which social norms play a really crucial role, and that allows us to construct the kind of policies that are fit for the problems that we face, whether that's climate change or the pandemic. So. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, Wendy, just to be a bit provocative, and given that inequality was listed by your students in the word cloud as the overwhelming challenge. And given that we've had a kind of breakdown in traditional class politics, do you go along with Thomas Piketty? He's just written a book, and in it, his solution to the world's problems right now, and he's a very distinguished economist, is a participatory socialism in which capitalism is gradually abolished with progressive income tax, tax on inherited wealth, about 60% for both, and that he uses that to finance a basic income and a capital endowment for every citizen. Now, of course, the Davos Brigade think this is pie in the sky, or is it forward thinking, moving economics beyond neoliberalism into a kind of sustainable economics and using the, the loaded word of socialism? Do you go along with that, or is there a halfway house? And we'll come back to that in the questions, I'm sure, with
I'm sure you will. And also when, yes, I'm sure we'll come back to that. I think that we can probably have a slightly more nuanced discussion than a discussion in terms of socialism and capitalism, which often doesn't make much progress because people already have, they sort of sit in one camp rather than another. So one way of trying to take that kind of discussion forward is to think slightly differently. And maybe I can show you another picture that would help us to imagine what that might be. So let me try and do that again. Okay, so this is the new picture, and what I've done here is to think about the COVID response, because thinking of a new problem is always a good way of thinking about whether an emerging framework is going to be useful. So bringing it back to your question, Anthony, we can think here of the blue vertex, we've got markets, and the red one, we've got government. And a lot of the way that that debate, including the way you presented the sort of Piketty position, is along that one-dimensional axis between markets and government. And what I would say, and this chimes very much with what Partha was saying, is that we have to have the third vertex, the civil society vertex, which has these different values, different motivations. So we certainly need the use of material incentives. We certainly need compliance with state authority, but we also need to be using or mobilizing the other motivations of reciprocity, altruism, and so on. And just like with colors, you can represent any color as a point in that in the space inside that simplex or inside that triangle. Then you can represent different kinds of policies, different allocations as a point in that space. And I've just put some in here relevant to the COVID-19 response. You can see some things are on the edges.
Yeah.
You can see some things are in a corner, like the massive role of the government as insurer of last resort. So that's happened under the pressure of the pandemic. It hasn't required a kind of Piketty style socialism versus capitalism to mobilize that authority in the face of a crisis like this. So just to throw this perhaps different lens onto the problem.
That's very helpful, Wendy. I have to move on. I should point out for US viewers that this is a UK color coding of government and markets, red being on the sort of Labour side and markets on the Tory side. Of course, in the US, those color codings would be reversed, given that the Republicans are red and the Democrats are blue. But anyway, I just want to move on to Charles Darwin's distant relative, Kate Jones. So, I've got some facts here. In the past 4 decades, a 60% decline in the populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians. Bee species have halved since the 1950s. 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction. That's about 1/4 of them. And the current extinction rates are around 100 to 1,000 times higher than the past several million years. So this is very daunting. You are an expert in measuring biodiversity. And of course, you worked with the great Georgina Mace, who was professor at UCL and sadly died earlier this month, to everybody's huge loss. What are the environmental strategies that you think offer the best hope of addressing the SDG goals? And how are we going to use data to really look at biodiversity loss and successful solutions? Big question.
Big question. Thank you for inviting me on. So I guess the key point really is how we treat our natural environment and how we view that in the short and the long term. So I would say that we need to start treating our natural environment not as a resource that you can keep taking and making profit on and increasing your GDP, but actually treating it as an asset. And that kind of shift in thinking means that actions which deplete the asset need to be thought of very carefully. So trying to build up economic systems, like we've been just talking about in the other two speakers, is really critical. So treating the natural environment as an asset. And I just want to kind of just dwell on some of the work of Georgina Mace just for a moment, if I can, Anthony, just because she was so critical to this type of thinking in conservation. So she kind of moved conservation, the subject of conservation and ecology, from just a kind of thinking about endangered species and pandas, but just starting to move beyond that to making the environment completely central to life on this planet and our human health and well-being. And she was one of the leading lights in understanding how to do that. So she was Georgina Mace was she was a professor of biodiversity and ecosystems at UCL, and she really started she developed a whole new centre here, understand the linkages between the natural environment and the links to human health and well-being. So she really set.
Kate, we're having a few problems with the connection right now. Do we have you back?
Hello?
Yeah. Carry on, sorry.
I'm sorry about my connection. I don't know quite what's going on. Okay, so Georgina was really central to starting the world to think about putting in which to make decisions. So she worked on several international treaties like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but it was really some really groundbreaking work for the UK government. So she established a natural capital framework for decision making.
Let me give you a question. I was going to ask you about COVID-19, because this is going to cause a, I don't know, 30, 40 trillion dollar hit to the world economy, maybe more, the biggest financial crisis since the Second World War. It's going to cause a mass increase in poverty. But is it really a biodiversity issue? And, from Sapatha's Economics of Biodiversity report, he says, there's a need for the human enterprise to live within the safe operating space of the biosphere. And my question is, if we can get you back, how can we measure a safe operating space? And if we're exceeding it, are we going to see more and more pandemics?
Oh, I think those are really great questions. Firstly, is yes, definitely. Infectious diseases from animals are a huge majority of all infectious diseases that humans have. And it's the disruption of ecosystems and the changing of communities and the links to human communities, which is causing the pathogens to leap over from animals into humans. So it's eco-degradation. Communities of animals are changing. Humans are interacting with that causes these problems. So this is an absolute case in point why you need a natural capital framework and natural assets in order to understand how to go forward for this crisis. So I was really interested in Wendy's triangle there, but I did notice that the ecology was completely missing. And I think that's something we need to think about when we're trying to understand the economics of this situation, is that it's our actions which are causing these disruptions, which cause these pandemics to happen. And this will just be one of many, is one of many, and will be one. So I think we need to have a much more cohesive, interdisciplinary look. You know, I can go on forever about public health, ignoring.
We've lost you again, Kate, but let me summarize by saying that the kind of well-being and health angle that Partha Dasgupta was talking about being crucial to inclusive wealth comes back again in terms of its interaction with the environment. Because if the environment is leading to mass pandemics on a more frequent basis, we're going to be in deep trouble. And but we'll come back in the questions, hopefully, to managing planetary goals. And I did have one comment about Wendy's diagram, suggesting that the US and the UK had focused on the government and the markets bit, but not the civil society component. And that's part of the reason why we may be in a much bigger mess than some of the Eastern countries and other European countries that have done much better with the pandemic. But I want to move on to Carol now, and we will bring you back in, Kate. Carol, all these economic, ecological ideas about sustainability are absolutely fine, but for them to be implemented, I think we would agree that we need a healthy democracy and politics. And the biggest invention in my lifetime has been the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee and colleagues. Do you think this digital revolution that we've experienced is our hope for sustainability, or do you still see it as a major political and democratic threat?
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks for having me today. I feel a bit out of my depth with all these great academics here and this very, interesting talk about economics. And I think it is interesting, this difference between the sort of projections of the world as we want it, and actually a world which is sort of spiraling out of control in real time, I would say, in sense of that there are these dynamics and forces at play right now, which are changing society so rapidly, I think, changing our systems of government, I think, so rapidly, that I think that I feel in many ways is that we haven't really grappled with really, as I say, sort of what is happening in real time. And I think, you talk about the World Wide Web there, Anthony, and that's one of the problems, is that actually the biggest forces on the internet is not this open World Wide Web, the open internet as we know it. It's these closed gardens which are owned by these Silicon Valley American hyper-capitalist companies who now control vast swathes of the internet. And in these vast swathes of the internet is where our politics and sort of public discourse is happening. And it's happening according to the rules which are invented by these very hyper-capitalist companies who are controlling particularly everything. The thing which I'm so particularly concerned around is around politics and our elections. And that's where I think we can see so many things which are the absolute sort of the pillars of our democracy are being eroded so rapidly. I mean, it was really interesting hearing Partha talk about the strong institutions that are needed, and how Britain here in the West has these strong institutions. has good governance and rule of law. And that is increasingly not the case, I think. And I think you can just look at, you know, an example right here in the news in Britain today, for example, is the awarding of contracts by the British government during this pandemic. And it suspended its normal oversight laws at the start of the pandemic. And we have seen story after story and contract after contract, which is looking sort of incredibly dubious. And we're relying upon different lawyers and civil society groups to sort of scrutinize this and look to take action. And I think, I mean, one of the things which I sort of find so fundamental to all of the different problems that we're talking about here, and Wendy's point about the students sort of emphasizing sort of inequality being at the heart of everything. I think that and the climate change being another one, but I think all of these issues we're not going to fix until we really take a long, hard look at what is sort of a crisis which underpins all of these, and that is this information crisis. And the fact that we are all communicating in our daily lives on Facebook, on Twitter, using Google, in these sort of walled gardens, where our sort of everything what we're communicating is inside this sort of, we're surrounded by the sort of toxic sewage of disinformation and misinformation that is being is sort of invisible to us, really. I think that's one of the greatest threats of it, is that we can't see and we don't really know what is being sort of seeded by who, and instead we just see the impacts of it. So sorry, that probably doesn't make much sense. I can explain a bit better maybe if you, but oh, you're muted.
Sorry, Carol, I was just going to say that how can we, you know, solutions wise, how can we challenge power elites when they control the media, the internet, all our oligopolies and our central banks? And, you know, and the problem is that a lot of people who vote believe that billionaires have earned their money, that their philanthropy offsets their greed, that the poor are undeserving, and to quote someone else, that any tinkering with the present distribution of wealth will lead to economic collapse. So this kind of neoliberal viewpoint is quite widely held. So what's the solution to this to try and get a more gentle, healthy, inclusive wealth?
I think maybe people who sort of went along with that, I think they felt protected from the sort of the tides of this sort of, you know, great chasm of inequality which is opening up. But I think if you look at the fact that even since the start of the pandemic, I think Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, I think his wealth has increased, I think it's 77 billion in that time. And so that's 77 billion, which is being taken out of our high streets, essentially. And that means out of the pockets of people that we know. You know, these things, you can't have, you know, both of these things simultaneously. Amazon becoming the biggest shop in the world, controlling so much of the world's retail, is just not compatible with healthy, vibrant town centres and, you know, firms, and not even just family firms, but also sort of big, you know, retail firms like John Lewis, etc. So I sort of think, I think maybe it's not just a matter of like, this just affects poor people and poor people down there and they deserve it. I think this is increasingly the middle classes, as much as anybody else, are going to be pinched and pinched and pinched. And beyond that, I mean, one of the things that I think is a sort of point which we've really failed to get across about the way that our politics is being manipulated and swayed by bad actors that are, you know, sort of outside our even visible, that just we just don't really know what is going on, and that's what these sort of these platforms enable.
Sorry to interrupt, Carol, but you made me think. Earlier this year, we published a Lancet commission called "The Future for Our Children?" chaired by Helen Clark. And one of the key things that emerged from it, from the sort of 5 key issues, was commercial exploitation of children. And we were horrified to discover almost every child in the world now is on the internet, connected by mobile phones, that their data and algorithms are applied to almost every child, so that people know where they live, what their sex is, what their religion is, what their social class is, and algorithms targeting them with adverts related to tobacco, to alcohol, to junk food, to their parents about formula milk, and increasingly to gambling. And we're seeing a pandemic of rising child obesity, of destruction of breastfeeding, and steep increases in young people gambling. So from a pediatric point of view, a health point of view, this is absolutely scandalous, and yet there is no regulation anywhere. We're trying to develop an optional protocol for the UN Convention on Children's Rights, but that's still going to be pretty loose. We've got to get governments to wake up to the need to regulate, but they're all scared, aren't they, of these big Facebook, Google, and the likes.
Yeah, it's really sad and really worrying, because I think that this, we've got, so I've been, which Anthony, of course, you know about, but we've set up a non-profit called The Citizens, which is sort of trying to create action around the issues around data and democracy. And we've got this fantastic 18-year-old student who started volunteering with us, who's amazing. And I was just really curious as to, because where his interest had sort of come from this, into this subject. And he sort of said, it's all right for you guys. He said, people of your age and your generation, yes, these companies have got a lot of data on you. They know a lot about you. But he said, my generation, he said, they know everything. They've had us from birth. We are the first generation which has been sort of online throughout our lives. And he found it, because he really sort of had looked into it and researched it, he found it sort of genuinely terrifying, I think, that these companies have this amount of granular detail about every aspect of these young people's lives. And I think we're only just starting to understand the ways that that can and may play out, and the consequences of that for absolutely years and years to come. And as I say, that amount, it just is, information is power. And that's, this colossal amounts of information concentrated in this tiny handful of companies, the power to influence and manipulate and control is, truly dystopian. And when you see the behavior of those companies aligning politically, which is what we've seen in the US, essentially, it's one of the huge issues around Facebook, that Facebook has aligned itself politically with the Trump regime, essentially. We've seen really worrying aspects of that. I do think that, dystopian is the only kind of word I find for it, really.
Okay, well, I've got to move on in a minute, but just on that last point, one thing that I found quite exciting, actually, was in the Senate meetings and briefings, the Democrats and the Republicans actually united against the big 5 companies, because they saw it as a threat to the American dream and to open competition in markets. And of course, Microsoft 20 years ago was found guilty of breaking antitrust laws and should have been paying a fine of 3 times their turnover, because that's the rules, but they managed to get out. They persuaded the Supreme Court not to fine them at all. But it's possible that politically we will move on and try to damp down in the same way that the big oil companies 100 years ago were tamed by antitrust legislation. But let's watch this space and see who wins the US election. But I want to move on to Ibrahim. We'll come back to these issues in the questions. And Ibrahim, Professor Abu Bakr, I should say, what is an equitable approach to health improvement? We saw that for economic students, inequality is the most important issue. How do you see global, regional, and within country inequalities? And how could we get an approach that produces greater equality?
Thanks, Anthony. Very happy with Ibrahim instead of Professor Abu Bakr. So I'll start by saying health and health improvement have wider determinants, and that despite pervasive attempts at medicalization, this is no longer debatable. We have ample data that shows that good health can be achieved at very modest cost, and societies that have equitable distribution of wealth and healthcare access have very good health outcomes. I think those are no longer debatable. All of the evidence points in that direction. Obviously, recent trends, as has been alluded to, on a global shift in politics to the right, have challenged some of those gains about true inclusive growth and equity, often in contradiction to what science and the evidence shows us. Actions are taken by governments that contradict that. In addition, many wealthy countries are moving from a relatively altruistic motivation where they help because they want to help, to one where they're driven by self-interest under the guise of global health security, an agenda that is emerging and getting stronger. And it's about the only way you get listened to if you try global health. Similarly, in their actions within their own countries, so for example, in the UK, health policies exclude purposely disadvantaged groups such as vulnerable migrants. So among a long list of global health issues, I'd like to look at this from two lenses. One in relation to history, colonialism, racism, xenophobia, and global structures, and the second around anthropogenic climate change and human population movement. So if I start with history, colonization, and racism, long established and ingrained structural inequalities that underpin our institutions, practices, and narratives of public health have determined immediately what is achievable in global health. And I think this has been worsened in the last half century by the neoliberal ideologies you referred to earlier, so that there's a whole new layer of systems that actually perpetuate some of those ingrained historical inequalities in global health. So for example, if we look at pandemic threats and the discussions we were having earlier, it's clear to me that the inequalities inherent to the approach around environmental protection, who controls data and technology, who discovers new compounds or vaccines, and how we distribute them, and even the design of the cities and places we live, are all tools that are used adversely and negatively to even disadvantage these groups further. And these issues also intersect with other dimensions of disadvantage, including race and ethnicity, gender, religion, social class, etc., and are used by a shift in our politics to disadvantage people who are vulnerable even more. We continue to comfortably ignore racism as a powerful driver of many of the inequalities we face, and the ethnic differences in the outcomes we've seen in COVID-19 and the tragic murders of Black men in the US by the police all starkly illustrate that these are fundamental drivers of inequality. So to shift a bit more positively in this issue of colonialism, racism, and xenophobia and what we do about it, I think to address this, we need civil society to organize itself better. I've had conversations with MPs and politicians where if you kind of reiterate what Carol was saying earlier and say, why isn't anything happening? Powerful forces are organizing themselves and shifting our democracies in a negative direction. And they all say, well, that would be wrong. And they are not willing to do anything about it. Some of those politicians are no longer in office. They've been swept out by the last election. It's remarkable that Western civil society is not able to do that. In the wider global health lens, I would start by borrowing the work of Arturo Escobar, the political scientist, who argues that drawing on the experience of indigenous and Afro-descendant activist intellectuals, we probably need to start looking at a wider lens than the narrow neoliberal Western lens that only sees the impossible, i.e. that we can only solve things from one perspective. And he comes up with this idea of a pluriverse of ideas. And we need to broaden our lens to be able to tackle the challenges that face us. I believe that us as university academics can work with others in civil society to begin to change the narrative so that we can craft solutions that take multiple perspectives and not just what is possible in this narrow lens. If I have a bit more time, yes, you can interrupt.
No, that's really interesting. And I mean, if you look at the United Nations, virtually all the top jobs are appointed by boards that are dominated by the West. The only post actually that is really elected by all the member states is WHO, and that's an Ethiopian in charge, Dr. Tedros, and he's received tremendous flack and criticism in the sort of the disputes between the US and China. But the other interesting thing is that Ngozi Iweala, who was the finance minister of Nigeria, a vice president of the World Bank, a PhD in economics from MIT, fantastic person, was up and the strongest candidate to be the director of the World Bank, and President Obama asked for a doctor, Jim Kim. And now I see that she is up again to be the Secretary General of the World Trade Organization, down to the final two, far and away the best candidate, and President Trump has vetoed her. I mean, it is interesting that the UN is still an unelected, non-democratic structure, and where we do have democracy, it gets derided. I mean, that's just an observation.
Yeah, and I'm, as you know, I am like Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, of dual nationality, a British and Nigerian. She is American and Nigerian, and yet it's the US government that is blocking her, which just sort of crystallizes what I was saying earlier, that there are obviously vested interests. And if we really are to change global health, we need a pluribus of narratives, and we need countries that are disadvantaged to be able to have a say. And this is multidimensional. It obviously includes gender as well. And as the COVID-19 response shows, women do a much better job in handling those outbreaks than men have done to date.
I agree. Just very quickly, Ibrahim, because we'll move on to audience Q&A. How is population migration going to interact with sustainability and the SDGs? From your perspective, have you got 2 or 3 comments you want to make about that from the Lancet Migration Commission?
Yeah, so I would start from a very broad lens and just take us through the fact that recent estimates by the Institute of Health Metrics published in the Lancet very recently, to which I wrote an accompanying commentary, shows that because of education and contraception, women are having fewer kids. Anthropogenic climate change and human population movement are going to be the key drivers of where people would be, especially the working age population. Now, that then means that for many wealthy countries, there is going to be, in the coming decades, a shrinkage of labor. And we really don't have a choice but to start looking at migration positively. Our Lancet Migration Report presents evidence and data on this that shows that, contrary to the myths and narratives that you hear in the media, especially in the right-wing press, migrants are healthier and migrants contribute productively to our economies, and that we have a moral obligation for those more vulnerable migrants that are unable to contribute in the same way. And therefore, the narrative has to change, and countries have no choice from one where migrants are seen as a burden to migrants seen. In fact, I believe that there will come a time in the not distant future where there will be a fight for that scarce resource of migrants across the world. So what we need is to balance that against a discussion around the implications of anthropogenic climate change and how to make sure that countries that have those growing populations are not exploited or disadvantaged, so that there is true inclusive growth in all settings.
Ibrahim, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the questions. So panelists, you might want to unmute because I'm going to fire in to various members of the panel. So let's go through the top. Do you think it's helpful to continue using the word capital if we need to radically move away and shift our attitude from the current system for sustainability? Is that a word that's too loaded? Sapatha?
Gosh, I think it's pretty much a waste of time worrying about words I know psychologists will say they have very powerful impact on us, but we ought to be thinking rather than just parroting words. These are assets. Many are global assets. And where I want to use just a minute to come into contact with what Carol was saying, because we are looking at, if I were to paraphrase her in my language, we're looking at global public goods which have been usurped by private interests. And she was mentioning the web. And if I had time, I would explain the fact that so much of the rainforests, tropical rainforests, are by pure accident under national jurisdiction. The oceans have no property rights, they're open access, and that's a public good too, pure public good. And so we have really a problem, which I think economics really hasn't tackled. All the growth models that we have, the models that are shaping economic ministries' thinking, miss out this fundamental fact that there are these enormous public goods which are being misused in different ways, of course. Carol mentioned one class of public goods, and my review spent an awful lot of time worrying about the public goods in the form of natural capital. And they're leading us to a world in which the future really is in jeopardy. You can talk about inequality. It's a deep problem, extremely important problem. But all of this will just pale into insignificance if we cross planetary boundaries because we are misusing our natural assets, which are global public goods. Small societies have experienced it. So we're not only looking at the future, we do have data on what happens to societies which have overshot their space. Carol was looking at the web as a space. Yep. I'm looking at nature as a space. So I would say, yes, we should continue to talk about capital, but if you wish to use the word asset, that's fine.
Okay. So there's a question here which touches on the issue I raised about Thomas Piketty, and I'll perhaps fire this at Wendy first. How does capitalism need to change to embrace inclusive wealth? What steps need to be taken to catalyze the journey, reduce greed, and get to a more balanced world?
I think.
Do you want to have a go?
All right, let's Partha first and then Wendy.
Very quick response. I think it doesn't help to think about capitalism as the one problematic institutional structure we have. Past societies which went by the term socialist or communist have been equally rapacious in its use of natural capital. I'm only looking at natural capital because that's very much in the forefront of my mind at the moment. Right. But you can translate it, you can skip into lateral thinking and talk about other forms of assets which have been. So I don't think it helps really talk about capitalism. But of course, we worry about it because we live here. But you try and live in a country which has absolutely no governance at all. Predatory government, completely destroyed communities. And then you will say, yes, England may be going down the tube because trust is very fragile, but it's still damn sight better than many, many countries out there. That's in the context of my observation, which Carol thought was relatively weak.
So are you a fan? Well, come on to Wendy. Are you therefore a fan of the Green New Deal?
I think there's a lot to be said for many of the elements of a Green New Deal as we exit from the pandemic. As you know, so that one of the things that can be done by policy is to set the rules about the future. And what Partha says is absolutely right. There's no question about the green transition. We have to make it. And the clearer are the rules, then the easier it is for all of us, but including businesses, to make investment decisions, knowing how the future is going to look. And the Green New Deal is one way of stepping in that direction, but aligning it as well with action in the very short term to mobilize resources in creating the infrastructure investments, creating that new capital. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with using the term capital in my view, those new assets that we'll need in the as we make the green transition.
But it's a jungle out there. I mean, you know, the stock markets of the world are an absolute jungle. And if any CEO decides to, you know, start investing in greening his whole company, you know, the risk is that because he's assessed every quarter on his profits, that he could be thrown out. And I say he advisedly, we'll come on to gender in a moment, because only about 4% of CEOs in the FTSE are, I think it was 4%, are women. But, you know, the brutal reality of this totally financially dominated world economy is that unless you make money in the next few months, you're going to be thrown out. Don't we need regulation, much better regulation of financial markets?
Yeah, I think that the risks, the business risks of the climate crisis are pressing more and more strongly on businesses. And you know, there are different elements to that kind of ecosystem. Some are moving much more rapidly than others, but the pressure of public campaigns has definitely been very effective in terms of divestment from fossil fuels. So we have to kind of mobilize across a whole range of tools. I don't think there's one silver bullet. There's popular pressure, there's pressure coming from evidence-based research that's coming out of the academy. There's pressure directly through political channels. So, you know, it's a multi-pronged attack that is going to be successful.
I want to come on. There's another great question. Well, actually, the most popular question is not a question. It says, Carol is an incredible journalist. So happy to hear from her today. So there you go. And I do recommend your TED Talk. If anyone wants to go and listen to it, it's fantastic. But I'm going to come on to how important is gender in the panelists thinking about human and natural capital. And I think it's very important. I'm going to ask Carol, then Kate, and then I might also ask Ibrahim to talk about that, and also race and ethnicity, and how we can harness positive aspects of those issues to improve it. So how important is gender, Carol, from your perspective? You're muted.
Thanks, Anthony. And thanks for the kind remarks. It's very nice. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting is that the greatest victims of kind of online harms are essentially the people who weren't in the room when the internet was being built, when these companies were being formed, when the rules were put in place as to how they were going to work. And that's women and minorities, essentially. You look at Twitter, you know, you look at who gets trolled on Twitter, and you know, the way that the fact that anonymity is allowed on the web, the fact that that has made certain forms of sexism and racism and anti-Semitism flourish, essentially, because there's no attribution. That didn't have to be the case. You know, it was really interesting. I spoke to this guy, Kevin Kelly. He set up one of the first online message boards. And he said that was a sort of random decision that they made. Actually, they could have made everybody have their real names. But that sort of early culture of anonymity, which has been so foundational to the internet, was just a rule which a kind of bunch of guys came up with on that first message board space and didn't realize the way it'd play out. I mean, just in terms of gender, I mean, I was listening yesterday to an interview with Hillary Clinton, and she was asked, do you think that you would have dealt with the pandemic better than, Donald Trump? And she was like, well, of course. And, you know, we look around the world, the countries, I mean, that's a fact. The countries which have dealt with it better are women, aren't they? But they're not the ones who are in control of these companies. And and also most countries. So I think, you know, it's a really, really interesting data point, I think, isn't it?
Kate, I hope your connection is okay.
Hello.
Any thoughts on gender in regulation of biodiversity?
Yeah, I think you know, women have been underrepresented in the academy, obviously, and as well as, you know, different cultural societies as well. But I think it's that multidisciplinary viewpoints which are missing in a lot of these debates. And I really truly think that, you know, we need to put ecology, natural assets at the heart of some of these decisions. And that means working across different disciplines. That means working in public health. That means working in architecture and master planning. That means working as a team together to cross disciplinary and policy boundaries. And I think women, I'm trying not to be sexist here, I think women, you know, do tend to build teams and be a bit more flat in terms of hierarchical structures than men.
Thank you. Just as an adjunct to that, I've been involved over the years with big teams doing studies on working with women's groups in all kinds of settings, specifically to get them to talk about pregnancy and newborn and maternal related issues. But when they come together in groups, almost all of them would come up with environmental issues that they wanted to address, whether it was clean water supplies or the degradation of their local environment or kitchen gardening or horticulture. And it was very interesting because they saw the absolute direct link between the environment, their well-being and health. And I think we have to tap into that much more. Ibrahim, race, ethnicity and sustainability. What's your perception, for example, in Nigeria of the perception of the climate crisis, the environmental crisis? Is it considered as a #1 issue, or is it a backwater issue?
So let me start very broadly by sort of agreeing with the other panelists that actually across all dimensions of diversity, whether it's gender, race, or others, you get the best talent and best ability by being inclusive. By excluding groups, whether it's by gender or race, you basically are not having your best deliver for you. And so it's not surprising if there are certain elements of what we do where you push the least able men to lead countries, that they have bad outcomes. I think that's not rocket science. Coming back to developing countries, and perhaps take Nigeria as an example. Nigeria contributes to what? Less than 0.25% of global emissions, huge amounts of poverty. So to the average ordinary person, despite the very clear implications of anthropogenic climate change and what would happen if you get things wrong, and that would affect the poorest countries first, it's a really difficult narrative to get people to buy into measures. After all, they are contributing less to the damage than those of us in rich, wealthy countries. Having said that, there are numerous examples of environmental movements that are successful in developing countries that we should learn from and copy, whether it's Wantari Maathai from Kenya or the Brazilian rainforest movement. Civil society groups can organize themselves, and even in the most vulnerable settings, can actually impact policy and government and move things in the right direction. So as academics and leaders in this space, we have a responsibility to support and work with these groups so that their voices are heard. Otherwise, the narrative would be that it is a Western problem and that people should not touch it. Over.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, a lot of students, when we're talking about climate change, a lot of students say, well, it's such a huge issue. What can I as an individual do? And I remember putting that to a philosopher once and said, what you as an individual can do is all you can do. So, you know, we need to turn it on its head and think about ways in which we individually or in small groups or collectively can agitate to bring about change. And I'd like to come back, because there's the question about civil society, come back to Wendy's triangle of government, markets and civil society. And it was, how could the, well, there's one about COVID. How could the COVID-19 response better include civil society? Another one about social capital in civil society. The countries with the best universities have the have the worst COVID responses. Why? Another is about, does the internet contribute to an individualization, allowing bad behavior, but reducing collective action? So I think this whole question of engaging with civil society creatively and positively through the internet, and through groups and through local action, it seems to be incredibly important. And it comes back to Partha's point about both socialist and, hard right governments have equally abused the environment in many ways. So what's a general thought about the role of civil society? Anyone? All right, let's start with Partha again.
Oh gosh, these are tough questions. How does one begin to answer? But let me try from one direction. So if somebody talks about assets or asset management, the picture that usually comes into mind is that of a stockbroker who shuffles stocks in the stock market. But of course, that's a misleading picture, because we are all asset managers. The farmer is, the trader is, the person in Ghana, a poor woman trying to make her ends meet in a large family is an asset manager. The assets are, of course, whatever assets happen to be around. He may not own much, but there are maybe the woodlands from which she can get something. So we're all asset managers, and the more we recognize that our lives are really concerned with managing our assets, that's what it's all about, to do as well as we can. And how we can feel we are part of the system of humanity. We're not detached. There are those chaps who are controlling everything, and we are nothing. That is true. None of us is much. But together we are big. And if we recognize that we have some commonality of purpose, doesn't matter with how poor you are or how rich you are, there's a shared experience you can talk about to each other in terms of management of assets. I'm using this, of course, I'm being very forceful on the asset side of things, actually, because that's what I'm working on at the moment. But we do need a common language, a common experience to share. And that might precipitate collective action. We're all in agreement that it's collective action which is missing. And the reason there's some hope in democratic institutions, no matter how much we are strained and crumbling, is that at least you don't get shot if you express yourself or try to arrange things. There are countries where you will lose your life. So we shouldn't be obsessed with the degradation of political life in the countries we happen to be here, or the States.
Yeah.
That obsession it's unhelpful. We should worry about it.
Yeah.
But we should then try and patch it. The way to do that, of course, is civil society all the way through.
Let's move on to Wendy. And I just also include another question that's come up very popular is, how do we ensure that the terms that we're using, inclusive wealth, natural capital, systems approach, it's all very intellectualized, it's kind of universityized. How can we make it much more down to earth and something that means something to everyone in the electorate?
Yeah, so this is, I think this is a really good question, and it touches on what Partha was just saying as well, because it's no good even just having like a coherent kind of framework for thinking about an alternative to the neoliberal paradigm, which I think is what a lot of the discussion here is about. We also have to have a narrative, we have to have stories, and we have to have a vernacular, a way of connecting this with people's everyday experience. And that's, that's where Carol and people who are really expert in communication have a role to play. But if you think about it, think of the neoliberal sort of slogans, like the government that governs best governs least. Okay, you can just repeat that, right? That's just comes off, trips off your tongue, sounds kind of very persuasive. You get what you pay for. It's another one. So we have to build a different vernacular, a different narrative. And something coming out of COVID is, for example, cooperation works.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
yeah.
This is a job for all of us. It's a job, wherever we kind of sit in the construction process for building a new paradigm, whether we're building the measurement base, the kind of work that Partha was talking about, whether we're in the game of connecting that triangle within the biosphere, which is what Kate was really drawing our attention to, whether we're communicating it as Carol was emphasizing so strongly, to the different generations. And this language is going to have to be different, right? It's going to have to kind of match the zeitgeist, but also the age geist of the different generations. And it has to speak to and has to have the right vernacular for different genders, different races, and so on. So I think as long as we see that this is part of a kind of unified challenge, then we're likely to be able to make more progress.
This is very interesting. I want to come on to Carol's thoughts about this, because your work with the citizens has also linked in a little bit with the kind of independent sage, which is an attempt to have more public engagement about the science. I mean, much of what independent sage does links up with the official sage, actually, but it's just trying to have that engagement with people directly using modern digital methods, but also the way you communicate. Any thoughts on this, Carol? It's relevant to students in universities, because what universities, I think, have been very good at is doing research. What they've been very bad at is communicating that in a way that engages both policymakers, but also electorates. Carol.
So there's so many threads to pick up on there, but exactly, it's that I think I went through a very bleak period of feeling very depressed about essentially, my work over the 4 years had uncovered, this corruption, these laws being broken, these companies out of control, etc., etc. But increasingly what we see in this age is that nobody really gets held to account in a way that we sort of hold up journalism, for example, as this, we think of it as like the Watergate scandal, where, presidents get impeached and people resign and things change. And really in this, we're in this sort of age of shamelessness now, where that doesn't work anymore. So really thinking about this, well, actually, how do you hold power to account? And you look at things like, the big tech companies, and you see, well, it's, that hasn't happened yet. There has been no accountability there. And so it's been, I really sort of went back, sort of, it has to come from the grassroots, and it has to come from people. And for us, it's really about sort of activating people around the idea of being citizens, and of actually that this isn't, it's not politics. Country, it's our country, it's not these companies' internet, it's our internet. And really sort of trying to pull people together in that way. And as Wendy says, is that one of the key things about this is it's just, you've got to tell the story differently, and you've got to get it to different audiences. And as much as that, I thoroughly enjoy writing for the Guardian Observer, only Guardian Observer readers read that. And you need everybody to seeing this and understanding what's going on. And so you've got to sort of take it to them and where they are. And just the final thing, which is, so yes, in terms of what we were trying to do with, helping independent sage get to this bigger audience, is, but we only started, we had our sort of first meeting earlier this year. But I was really inspired because we had this investigative journalist called Duncan Campbell come to the first meeting, and he was actually a founder member of Stonewall. And he said, he just was he was of the well, it takes a small group of people, it's got to start somewhere. And, they went from a small group of people to now the fact that, gay marriage is legal. And that's happened in half a lifetime. So that is my sort of reason. I've got lots of reasons to despair, but those are my reasons for hope also.
There's a question, Carol, very quickly to you. If Biden is elected, does Carol see things getting any better in terms of digital democracy, or are we doomed either way?
Well, I think there's two bits of that question, because I can see Biden potentially getting enough votes to win. I have real questions about whether Donald Trump is leaving that White House, I have to say. He said that, so I just, one step at a time is all I'm thinking.
Okay, so there's quite a few questions here about, so one is, how do we move away from GDP as a measure of success towards a sustainable economy? What do people think of the ideas in Donut Economics by Kate Raworth? And there was one that I can't see, but it was about the way the financial authorities and establishment have hijacked a lot of the language, and how we could move from not thinking about ourselves as consumers, but as stewards of natural assets and the future. So before I ask you the final question, I'm going to come around to all the panelists. We've got a few minutes. Does anyone want to pick up on any of that? And there's another one. What is the contribution to inclusive wealth of education, particularly higher education, and it's shifting between a private and public good? Gosh, there's lots of issues there. Do anyone want to pick up? Kate, we haven't come to you for a while. Anything you want to say about any of those issues around donut economics, moving on from GDP, us as stewards, or the role of higher education?
Yeah, I think I was quite inspired by donut economics, actually, because I realized that Kate had put together an idea that she was posing to the economists, and we'd been talking about for a while as ecologists, but she was kind of pitching that idea and that kind of planetary boundaries idea to a different audience, and that was really inspiring, that this was taking off somewhere. And actually I've been quite optimistic over the last few years. I know that seems a bit weird, but the ecology and the climate crisis and the extinction crisis are now on the agenda of everybody. There's Extinction Rebellion and David Attenborough, and those things weren't happening, and we seem to be shouting in the void. And I think there's a lot more activism around that, and a lot more realization that that's at the heart of who we are and our health and well-being. And so I'm actually quite optimistic that it's moving in the right direction.
Okay, so Partha, I think you've campaigned to move away from GDP as a measure of success and the sort of monetary value of everything. Do you think you've been heard by the economic establishment, or is there still a very long way to go?
Well, I sort of share Kate's view, because these are analytical issues. This is not ideology. So it's not exactly something that you have to fight through. You just have to be very clear and place it in the context of the grammar that exists and the grammar which is correct. So I'm not worried about it. The difficulties are really administrative, where we got a huge infrastructure of statistical infrastructure built on measuring a flow of goods and services, which is GDP. And its main weakness, there are many other weaknesses, but its main weakness is that it doesn't include depreciation of capital. It's gross, not net. And so we should be looking at stocks. What stocks do we pass on to the next moment, to our next generation? And so our founding father of my discipline, it wasn't an accident he wrote his book called The Wealth of Nations. It wasn't the GDP of nations, the wealth of nations. And so, of course, the notion of wealth that now can be constructed is far richer than what he was able to do. Well, that's because it's 250 years ago. We've got a much better idea of the structure of assets that we inherited from the past. So it can be done, and it will be done. There is no resistance to it. Bear in mind one thing, though. The idea of GDP was established for macroeconomic management of the short run during the Depression, when it was extremely important to figure out how much of economic activity there is, because it was tied up with employment. And if you have 25% unemployed workforce, boy, you do really need something which is going to be useful. Somehow, after the war, it was extended to become a measure of well-being, and that wasn't the intention. So it wasn't anything evil here. It was just literally a mishandling of a concept. And well, as I began by saying, these things happen incrementally. Discipline develops with historically, as it were. So it's path dependent, and we moved away. So the reason I've been very skeptical of contemporary economics is not because of things like information. There's been marvelous stuff there. It's our entire conception of economic possibilities that have been really captured by an idea that nature doesn't matter. You ignore it.
Okay.
They really are misleading.
Very quick, there's another question actually. As inequality is the most obvious problem that economists must focus on, what about peace and social inclusion? And how do we address them collectively? Wendy, very quickly, because I'm going to come on to a final question to all of you to answer in 30 seconds each. How do you respond to that? Do you think the teaching of economics in our universities in UK and Europe is changing? And do you think we are grasping the nettle of the whole SDG agenda?
Yes, I think the way we teach economics is changing quite dramatically. I think it's not completely, it's not got as far as Partha suggests, but it's definitely moving in that direction. I think we can do things. So just taking up Carol's point about, small beginnings, we began this project to try and change the way economics was taught in 2013. It's been an entirely voluntary effort by researchers from around the world. We now have 125,000 students every year in more than 300 universities in 68 countries using the free open access online materials. The internet makes this possible, but it was the community being willing to invest the effort in creating a global public good that has made it effective. So we can really change things. We can really change the way economics is taught. We are changing it. 48 of the 60 universities teaching economics in the UK have made this change.
Okay, excellent. Final question. You've got no more than 30 seconds each. Start with Ibrahim. We'll go in reverse order. One thing that you would recommend to policymakers or other stakeholders to help achieve inclusive wealth from your perspective? One thing.
Sure. So 30 seconds and counting. So from my perspective, tackling the needs of the most vulnerable groups here, whether we mean homeless individuals or vulnerable migrants, would be absolutely key. And policymakers need to make that front and center. Our Prime Minister experienced COVID, and we know that the health of our weakest will determine the health of all of us. And I think that we need to advocate for and make sure that the health of the most vulnerable is at the center of all policy making. Thank you.
Thank you. So addressing homelessness, and I'll remind people that 40% of the world's children live in slums. Okay, next, let's go to Carol.
The internet is not the Wild West, or at least it is the Wild West, but it shouldn't be. We have laws in this country, they're just not enforced online. We don't allow incitement to violence. Why do we allow it online? Sorry, yeah, that's it. That will be it.
So my point is anonymity on the net. I love Twitter. I gained so much, but I'm quite happy to be named. I don't think people should be allowed to be anonymous, but that's another debate. Kate, what's your one thing?
Well, I think it's inspired by the COVID pandemic, really, and that the public health community have an enormous amount of power internationally and nationally, enormous. And actually, if we want to get some of the economics and natural capital and natural assets into, policies, we need to talk, the ecologists need to talk to them. And also the public health people need to be less narrow in what they conceive as a problem and be more wider. They're good on climate change, they have been, but climate change is like your house is falling off a cliff in a couple of years. And biodiversity change and land use change and degradation is like it's also on fire. So we really need to start talking to each other.
Thank you very much, Kate. Very quickly to Wendy.
Okay, big tax changes to bring about serious redistribution of wealth. When wealth is more equally distributed, it allows people to take risks and to innovate. And we will be able to mobilize both innovation and fairness through this policy.
Great. Tax, that's important. Sir Parthy, the last words with you.
Right. That's how the review ends. It's a plea towards governments to encourage students, children from the earliest stage of the education to become naturalists.
I love that.
The surest way of ensuring that the next generation takes nature seriously.
Thank you. I really love that, actually, as a final statement. We're just a minute over time. We're going to move on in about 10 minutes to the final session, which is going to be more UCL focused about the role of the university and what we can do next. But I'd like to thank all the panelists for a fantastic session. Thank you to the audience for some brilliant questions. And a huge thanks to the people behind the scenes who've organized this whole, Beyond Boundaries virtual conference, which shows you don't have to be traveling everywhere to conferences. And I'm going to name one person, Lucy Crick, for the fantastic work that she's done in pulling all of this together. But there's a huge team behind her, and with Higher Frequencies, the company that have helped us run it. So thank you so much to Partha, Wendy, Ibrahim, Carol, Kate, and do join us again in about 8 minutes' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.